Hey guys, welcome back to Introduction to Sociology with Dr. John. And today we're going to be talking about power. Power! Everybody wants power, right? Well, we'll be talking about politics and economics. Those are two of the most important forms of power, but not the only ones. Today we're going to be talking about the overall nature of power as it's generally seen in the social sciences, and in the next two lectures we'll be talking about politics and economics specifically. Again, remember, this is just an overview, just an introduction to these topics. So if you're interested in these themes, you want to do a lot more studies in this area, there's a lot more to be done. So what is power? And what is the relationship between politics and economics? Both politics and economics are forms of social power. They exist because people are doing something, right? That's essentially, power comes down to people doing something. So one way of looking at things is, for example, Weber defines power as the ability to get others to do what you want them to do, even if they don't necessarily want to do it. Maybe especially if they don't want to do it. But that could include a number of things. It could include forcing people. That's one kind of power. But the most important kind of power is to get people to think that they, or to believe, or to sincerely want to do something. So that should, you don't just think of power in terms of force. That's not the same thing. Power, if you can get things to happen and people go along with it, that's even better. Now, power is based on dependence in a big way. So one person A, his power over person B will be proportionate to B's dependence on A. So what does dependence mean? So here's an example. A professor's power over his or her students. What is that power? Well, the students fear that the professor may give them a bad grade or may fail them. So that makes the student dependent on the teacher. So that gives the teacher power. Now, if you turn it around and said, well, what if all the students get together and complain about the teacher, then that could turn it around. So you might be able to say, well, the teacher depends on the students. But notice the relationship. So the students have to all be organized in order to be able to have power over the teacher. Whereas the teacher's position automatically gives him more power over the students as individuals. What about another example? A consumer's power over Walmart. So you go into Walmart, you've got $20 in your pocket. You can choose to decide to spend that $20 any way you like. Does that give you power over Walmart? Well, how much is $20 relevant to Walmart's overall budget? So they're talking billions and billions of dollars of revenue. Your $20 is really not making them dependent on you, right? On the contrary, you're kind of dependent on them because you don't have many other choices to go to. Maybe they're the only store in your neighborhood because they've put all the other businesses out of work, or maybe because they're cheaper because they can get cheap goods from China. So therefore, you depend on them for those cheap goods. So again, if all the consumers get together, right, and everybody said, okay, we're not shopping at Walmart anymore, Walmart would be out of business tomorrow, right? But because we only deal with Walmart on an individual basis, they're going to have power over us. So you see some of the implications here. Generally, one person has more power if they have higher status in the system or more economic clout, or more political clout, but that can be turned around when people organize against it. So power really comes down to people, whether or not we organize. And take an example, employer's power over employees. Again, you as an employee, you walk into a factory and say, can I have a job? As an individual, that factory is much bigger than you. They can pick between you and 1,000 other people who also want that same job. So you don't have a lot of bargaining power. They are not dependent on you, you are dependent on them. But if all the employees organized and said, you have to hire us at these salaries, or nobody's going to work for you, well, then the employer has, well, no option as long as they're stuck in that situation. Of course, they're going to try to change the situation. So power is about dependence. Dependence depends on a number of different factors, and I'm giving you one big clue is about organization. So if you think about these three situations, how are they similar or different? Well, obviously the professor's power is based on his status. A consumer's power, or Walmart's power in this case, is based on money. An employer's power is based, well, also on money, but maybe to some extent politics, right? In any case, the point is dependence is the key here. Behind dependence is how much or how effectively people can organize. Because it doesn't matter how much money somebody has at the end of the day, if nobody's going to work for that money is worthless. Right? So imagine you're on a desert island, right? And one person's got $1 million and the other person has a chicken that lays 2 eggs every day. Who's the richer person? And not the guy with $1 million. Because that guy cannot eat his money. His money is worthless. Right? So effectively, we'll talk more about this in economics. It's not about money. It's not about position. It's not about politics. It comes down to people and how effectively they're organized. So, politics and economics are institutions that organize collective behavior. So, think of that, right? So, as I said, power comes from organization. Here are 2 types of institutions that organize behavior. Now, they organize behavior in particular ways. Politics organizes people through elections, mass meetings, propaganda. In other words, largely through voluntary participation or organization, usually backed up by force, right? Some element that people are willing to force others to go along with it. So, for example, if you pass a law, right, that law requires force behind it. Otherwise, there's no point passing a law, right? If you pass, for example, let's say everybody's gonna help pay money, i.e. taxes to support the government to maintain police, fire, whatever. So that's the politics, is deciding what to do and then enforcing it. Right? And force means if people don't participate, then something bad is going to happen to them. Right? So that's politics. And one reason people think of politics in a bad way is because of that element of force. Right? It's all very well when we're on the majority side, then we're the ones making the decisions. But when we're on the minority side, we feel like we're being forced by other people to do something maybe we don't want to do. Economics, on the other hand, organizes people through the workplace. So we'll be talking about this in our subsequent 2 lectures much more in depth. So workplace, marketplace, money, through money, wages, and profit. Now, how does this work as a system of power? We don't force people, we create an exchange with people in which essentially I say something like, I need a loaf of bread, give me a loaf of bread, and in exchange I'll give you a token that represents some amount of my work and effort, right? So instead of me directly exchanging, for example, I can exchange 5 minutes of this lecture for a loaf of bread, right? Sound good? Well, do you need 5 minutes of this lecture right? Well, maybe you do, but does the bacon need 5 minutes of this lecture? Right? That's the problem. So we have these tokens, right? It's called money, right? So what money does is it allows me to sell my labor in doing this lecture for a certain amount of money, and then you purchase it with a certain amount of money, and then with that I can go to the store and buy something else with a certain amount of money, and eventually it'll all flow around, right? So it'll all balance out, right? And this again is voluntary, and we don't see force involved, because at each point we make a choice, right? I will agree to give you $1 for a loaf of bread. You will agree to pay a certain amount for a lecture on sociology. And somebody will pay you for something you've done, such as, selling something or working for the afternoon or something like that. So we think of it in terms of choices, but in fact, there's a lot of force involved in economics as well. So we'll be talking about that, but just to give a quick example, think of, if you are really hungry and you go up to somebody and say, hey, I'm really hungry, can I do something for you? Well, they've got, again, dependents, right? You're dependent on them to give you money. So they can force you, in a certain sense, to agree to do something for them that maybe otherwise you wouldn't have done, right? Maybe work for a whole day in exchange for a loaf of bread, when normally you would say that's not good. So that's what I mean, that whereas politics seems to involve force, in fact, it's assuming a volunteer that everybody's agreeing to participate. So you only need force to make sure that people participate. In economics, it appears to be based on choice, but underneath that choice there is an element of force. And of course, in reality, these are constantly interwoven. These are two different sources of power, one can say, that interact. It's not an all or nothing thing. Right? Although in theory, under communism, the idea was that politics would be dominant, that people would voluntarily decide to do things. They wouldn't do things for monetary exchange. They would do things because they wanted to, and then you would maybe need force to push along the recalcitrant ones, right? Unfortunately, as communism evolved in places like Russia, a lot more force was involved in voluntarism. On the other hand, in economic systems and marketplaces, it requires force in order for people to volunteer, or to make agreed on choices. In other words, why if you don't have any money, why not just steal a loaf of bread? Well, because they're going to grab you and throw you in jail, because that's a violation of one of the political agreements that you have signed up to as a voluntary member of this society. And, or why don't you just steal money from the bank? Why not just take it, what you need? So again, if you didn't have that political system, the economic system would not work. Doesn't matter if you want to call it capitalist or communist. Each one requires the other. So one concept you've probably heard before is the concept of the nation state. And of course, this is very much rooted in our current analysis in politics and the sociology of politics. But keep in mind, the nation state is a relatively modern concept. So first of all, the idea of the nation state is a government or a state institution that represents a given nation, which is a territorial area demarcated by borders that in theory represents or generally represents a specific ethnic group, right? So Weber's interpretation of the nation state, or his definition of it, was that the nation state is the only political institution that can use legitimate violence within a certain territory. Then we'll talk about the concept of legitimacy in a bit. But what does that mean? So, for example, if I come up to you and hit you on your head and steal your money, right, is that legitimate? No, it's not. It's called robbery. I do not have the right. So legitimacy goes back to legal, or the system that is a right-based system, right? So what is legal violence? Well, legal violence would be when you have a law that says you shall not steal. So if I steal your money, the government, the state, has the obligation to grab me and do violence to me, essentially, right? So they're going to put me in jail, or they're going to punish me in some way. That is what Weber is referring to as legitimate violence. He's not saying that any violence by the state is legitimate. No, on the contrary, right? If a state uses violence not following the law, that is not legitimate, and that is not in actually a proper state, right? Because it's corrupted, it's become a corruption of the state system. Now, the notion of a nation state is a very recent institution. It's really not until, first of all, that you have a surplus, which means usually an agrarian society or a commercial society would have a state, would have a government, because that's when you can collect taxes, you can have soldiers and police and courts and things like that, right? So think of governments existing, or a state is existing since ancient times in the forms of old city-states in Greece and other places that govern themselves, or empires like the Roman Empire, the Persian Empire, the Chinese Empire, that controlled large areas and controlled them by using legitimate violence, by maintaining law and order, as it were, right? So, for example, if you are a peasant, right, obviously you don't like to give anybody any of your food, but you might prefer to give, let's say, a quarter of your food or a third of your food to the government to protect you against having a bandit come down and take all your food and maybe kill you as well. So the point is, as long as the state does its job and maintains law and order, at least according to one theory, then people will generally accept it, right? Now, over time, of course, the role of the state has grown significantly. So that means societies become more complex. Think about the United States, for example. In 1790, there were 1,000 federal employees, right? At that time, there were about 2 million Americans. So that means there was one federal employee for every 2,000 citizens, right? Not a large amount, right? In fact, you'd be very hard pressed to find a federal employee in that system, right? Most important ones are probably the post office. That was the biggest service from the very beginning, right? The United States Post Office. So today, there are 1.7 million federal employees. Now, that seems like a huge number, but let's do the math. There are 350 more or less million Americans. 1.7 million is about 1 out of every 200 American citizens works for the federal government. And by the way, when I say that, I am not including military personnel, only civilian personnel. So 1 out of every 200, let's make that clear, 200, right? So it looks like a huge increase from 1,000 to 1.7, but in fact, it's really only a tenfold increase when you compare it to the population. But still, it's still an increase, right? So why is the government so big? Well, one, because we're a larger society, there's more issues to deal with. So the post office, for example, maybe in 1790, the post office, I'm not sure if there was actually a post office in 1790, so let's forget about that. Now the post office is several 100,000 people because they're delivering letters all over the country. right? And they do a pretty good job. You think about it, you put something in the mail in New York, and 3-4 days it's going to pop up in Los Angeles. That's not bad. So, and that helps create communication. We have packages going back and forth. So a lot of economic benefit is done by this. And you would say, well, why should we get rid of it? On the other hand, also there's bureaucracies like the defense ministry, right? Besides soldiers, you need people to do the logistics, to make sure things are ordered on time, to make sure we're not overspending, to make sure people get paid, right? So again, you're going to need a large workforce to handle all that paperwork. Then you have crime is different issues, right? There's a lot more interstate criminal activity, so you need a federal police force. You need federal regulations to regulate health and safety, to regulate food production. All of these things have been added. And of course, you could argue about each one. Is it really necessary? Why not let the states do it? Of course, states and local areas do a lot of their own governing. And in fact, there are more state and local employees in the United States than federal employees. But the point is, since a lot of commerce is between states, you're going to need some federal level of regulation. And this is all provided in the Constitution. It's become bigger. Has it become too bureaucratic? Has it become too big? Well, that's always a matter of debate of what exactly the government should be doing, should not be doing, what should local governments do, state governments do, and federal governments do, and so on and so forth. Now, as the state has become larger and more important, there are obviously different debates about why this is necessary. On the one hand, you have people like Thomas Hobbes. He was a social philosopher in the 17th century. He wrote a book called Leviathan, and he believed, essentially, to simplify his argument, that if people were left on their own, they would just grab whatever they wanted. In other words, people were not very nice. So you need a system to control their natural urges, right? To prevent them from just going out and grabbing stuff. So in a certain sense, he's saying humans are naturally evil. You need a government to control them, to make sure they behave, and therefore we can have commerce, we can have interactions, and we can have an economic system. So Thomas Hobbes, in a certain sense, is part of the basis of the functionalist view of the state. On the other hand, you have people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He was a philosopher in France during the period just before the French Revolution. He argued that it wasn't the state that was the root, was protecting people, but rather the state protects the rich, and it's private property that makes people evil. In other words, if everything were distributed evenly, people would have no reason to steal, right? But because some people have more and other people have less, therefore you have people who want to steal. Then, of course, the rich need the state to protect them, because they would not be able to protect themselves with only their private security guard, right? So think about, for example, in the Middle Ages, every lord had his own private security guard, but how many could you have? Maybe 20, maybe 30, maybe 50. You know, there's a lot more poor people than that, and when they wanted to, they would rise up and crush you. So the aristocrats needed to be organized and create a state, a government headed by the king, whose primary job was to come down and crush the peasants if they ever tried to rebel, right? So remember what I talked about, organization, right? The peasants, if they organize, will be able to overcome any one lord. However, if the lords are organized, that is the rich people, they will use that organization through what we call the state to keep the masses oppressed. So this follows conflict theory. The functionalist theory, basically, as we talked about before, the state provides a certain function, the state provides law and order, it provides for the common good, as it says in the U.S. Constitution, the common welfare, planning and direction, enforcement of norms, arbitration of conflicting interests, protection against other societies, protection against nature. So, for example, when we have a pandemic or we have a change in the climate or a massive storm, you need something more than just the individual, right? The community has to organize. How do you do that? You have to have some kind of government. The state has grown because society is more complex and needs more regulation, right? So if you have a small village, everything within a small village can be managed by one person. But if you have a huge city, you need police officers, you need this, you need that. So it's a much more complicated operation. Conflict perspective, as I said before, the state is a way by which some groups impose their values and norms and system of stratification on others. So the ruling elites, the rich people, as it were, in today's society, they're going to benefit, right? So if I have $100, the police are protecting my $100, but J.D. Rockefeller has $100 million. His whole $100 million is being protected by the system, right? And much more effectively, because he's able to put his $100 million in a bank, and not only is it protected by police and by the jails and the military, but it's protected by the insurance systems. So even if somebody does manage to steal his money, he'll just be given his money back, right? According to conflict theory, the state is, according to some conflict theories, particularly Weberians, the state may be seen as something like a mafia, a con game, that they promise to protect you, a protection racket. They come around, they say, oh, pay your taxes or something bad might happen to you, right? And of course, states are also competitive. They try to compete. The state is based on territory, so the greater the territory or wealth within that territory, the more powerful the state. So some conflict theorists think the state itself has its own interests as a ruling elite. Of course, there's a lot of debate between the conflict theorists. There is a debate between what we call instrumentalist theorists and structuralist theorists. So essentially, the instrumentalist theorists believe that economic power translates directly into political power. So this is like the argument of Karl Marx, who said that the state is the tool of the ruling class. The ruling class rules society through the state, and so the state is just the instrument of the ruling class. On the other hand, structural theorists believe the state has its own interests. As I said before, the state had the bureaucrats and the officials and even government officials will have more power if they have a larger space, right? A larger territory with more economic activities going on that they can tax. So the state may not necessarily simply reflect the economic elite. It may have its own interests. So in some sense, there may be competition. So Weberian conflict theorists tend to focus on the competition between, or sometimes collaboration and sometimes competition between the capitalist class and the political, as it were, ruling class. Another very important issue is the issue of legitimacy. We talked about this a little earlier. Legitimacy, if you remember, power is the ability to get others to do what you want, right? So if you have to use force, that kind of power is very limited, because as soon as you leave, people will stop doing what you want them to do, right? So basically, the idea of power is that it's more effective if people accept it, right? So either they accept it as a given or they agree with it, one or the other, right? If people accept power, this is called authority, right? Authority means people accept the idea that you have the authority. You can give the law. That's what authority means. It means authoring the law, right? So legitimate power, in other words, means people feel you have a proper power. Your power is correct. You deserve to have it, right? And that then gives you authority. Right? So if people accept your power as legitimate, this will make life much more easy for you, because when you ask people to do something, they will believe you have the right to tell them to do it. On the other hand, you might notice you go down the street, you tell somebody, give me $100, they're probably not going to give you $100, right? They're not going to believe that you have the right to just demand $100. In fact, they might call the police and have you arrested, right? But on the other hand, when the tax authorities come around and say, oh, give us $100 or $200, so people are going to be like, yeah, okay, here you go. Why? Maybe they're not happy, but they agree that the government has the right to collect those taxes. They have that authority. So there are different kinds of forms of authority. This is what Weber is getting at. Some forms of authority are based on tradition. So, for example, monarchy, right? In the old days, it was all about who was the king, who was the lord, and the tradition said you had to give the king his taxes, you had to give the lord his rents, you had to give the priest his tithe, right? Maybe you didn't like it, but that's what tradition said. So you didn't want to break tradition, and usually tradition was reinforced by religion, of course, right? Because if you break tradition, you break religion, and you're going to spend eternity burning in hell, right? So, but basically it comes down to, this is the way we've always done it, it's always worked, so just do it, right? That's traditional authority. Another form of authority is legal rational authority. This is the authority that's legitimated by specific written rules and procedures. This is much more modern, although it has emerged out of traditional power in a certain way, that we've said, okay, as long as you follow the proper procedure to become the king or the leader, we will consider you the legal ruler of the country, right? So rational part means that there's a logic behind it. So, for example, in democracy, we vote, we go through a procedure, and then as long as that procedure is followed properly, we accept the person who is elected. Whether we like that person or not, we will accept, okay, he's the president, because he came through that procedure, right? He got the stamp of approval. And it's legal because it followed the law. It's rational because the procedure, excuse me, the procedure makes sense, and also the system makes sense, right? This way we don't have to have a war every time there's a change of government, right? So, like, many people in America don't like the president. Many people didn't like the last president. In fact, most American presidents have not been liked by probably most Americans at one point or another. But the point is, they were there and we followed their orders because they had followed the procedure, and this kept a level of tranquility in society. Now, the third kind of power is something a little bit strange. It's not really sociological, but remember, Weber is a bit of a strange person. He always believed that there is some irrational element in society. So here he talks about charismatic power. So charismatic power is some ability of people to attract people to them. So based on this attraction, people may feel that you are a legitimate ruler or leader, even though you're not born into a position or you were never elected to a position, right? And charismatic power may be, for example, explain the rise of dictators, or the rise of, not necessarily dictatorship is the only solution, the rise of leaders like, for example, Gandhi, or even people like Jesus Christ, or people like Muhammad, religious leaders, very often rise up with some kind of charismatic power around them. The Weber says we can't really fully explain it. It's the belief of people at that time in that particular person. So you might have people like Adolf Hitler or Stalin creating charisma or having some charisma. And of course, charisma can also be produced to a certain extent by propaganda and things like that. Now, the point he's making is these are three different ideal types of authority. Most systems will combine elements of each. So, for example, in the American system, we have elections, but charisma is a factor, right? Some people are more charismatic than others, or they appeal somehow to people in a different way. And so charisma may be one of the factors involved in elections, right? We also know that charisma was important very often for leadership in the monarchical system. So a king without charisma might end up being killed or deposed, right, by somebody who was more energetic, who had more charisma, who had more support from the population. But generally, you can't just push yourself in like that necessarily unless the system is very, very weak. So, for example, Hitler was able to overthrow the democratic system in Germany because that system was very, very weak and faced with a crisis it couldn't handle, the Great Depression. Keep in mind that any system will typically have some combination of these elements. So thank you very much for following me. Sorry this lecture went a little bit long, but see you next time for your next lecture. Bye.